Hello and welcome back to the last session of this edition of March meeting, which is entitled The Return of Stolen First Nation People and Culture. And it's a pleasure to welcome John Harvey, writer, Brown Cabs, Matthew Lutton, Artistic Director, Malthouse Theatre, and Jason Tamiru, Director and Cultural Custodian, Malthouse Theatre. The session is moderated by Surafel Abebe, Assistant Professor, Performance Studies and Theory, the Africa Institute. The Return, a play written by John Harvey, directed by Jason Tamiru and Matthew Lutton, introduces you to a museum and 5 of its workers as they prepare for an upcoming exhibition of First Nations artifacts and culture. The reality of the workers is interrupted by scenes from the past about how Indigenous remains were exhumed from sacred sites, sold to science and museums to create the collections that are on display today. The play traces the arrival of one particular human remain to the museum and the journey of a worker realizing throughout the play that he and all the workers are actually spirits trapped in this museum, needing to return to country by repatriation. The play concludes with he and his family's remains being repatriated back on country as the other spirits in the museum wait for their time to be returned.
Welcome to the Museum of Origin. We'd like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. We are very proud to say that we have the most comprehensive Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection in the world.
Are you okay? Scarlett, what is it? Where are you from, Mary?
I'll shoot them!
That's a wrap! I just wanted to let you know that we've decided that this year's major winter exhibition will be a First Nations exhibit.
Hey! I got a bone! They're the fresh ones.
We need to sell one to Edinburgh, we'll ship one to London, and we'll keep one. All the way down to the Australian mainland native. Below there, the Tasmanian native.
We return our people home to country so they can continue their journey in healing their spirit, and in doing so, to heal our own spirit and the spirit of this country.
One, two. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in front of all of you. Thank you. Thank you to the Sharjah Foundation for having us. I'd like to also thank the Arab world for having us also. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the tribes, the old tribes of this land. The spirit is still here. And I'd like to acknowledge all of you, the world. Thanks for coming. everyone's got the right to determine their identity. That's a human right. My people weren't given that opportunity. The identity on us is not true, it's false. Today I want to share who I am, our culture. Okay. What you see up there is the model for life. It's our connection to understanding our world. It's understanding where we come from. Our connection to creation, not only on the earth, but to the stars. The diamond is a boundary. But on the land, there are many diamonds, many tribes. One diamond, burial ground. Another diamond, ceremony ground. Another diamond, men's area, women's area, children's area, place for law, place for death, place for story. That's connection. Those connections we call the dream time. That's our dreaming. The boundary that connects us to Mother Earth, our land, Woka. The sky, Bachelor. The boundary of the water, Walla. Barunga. Connection to the tree, the boundaries of our country. We connect to the sky. Duta. The stars. Uringa. The sun. Yarinja is the moon. We acknowledge your creation. Our ceremony connects to all the diamonds. That's tribal law. My culture is the oldest culture on the planet. 80,000 years. We've walked our land, stayed true to our law, our customs, and our beliefs. The white man come to our country and change our world. Mad scientist, Charles Darwin, crazy man. He did not think we could survive. We were classified as hunters and gatherers. The people not fitting for the new world. Across our country, we have 500 nations. Many burial sites. Our families are there. We were seen as a dying race. Our loved ones that were buried became possessions, prized possessions for bone collectors. They'd come to our burial sites and dig up our families. Legs, arms, skull, fingers, feet were sold around the country, and they shipped around the world. Our people were shot, murdered for our land and for our bodies. Our spirit, our people, there's no full stop in our dream time. We continue and connect. Our old people, our land, our animals, our families, our rivers, ocean, trees, creation, they mourn for our people to come back home. We get our people from the institution and we bring them back to country. We bring them back to country to bury them back on land. We don't get buried in different diamond, because that diamond's not our spirit country. Our people, we get buried back in our diamond. And those diamonds are across the whole land. The institutions resist in giving back our family, which is hard to understand why. But we do. We bring back people back to country. All tribes, they gather to the ceremonial ground. This is the ground where our people have been bred for tens of thousands of years. Sorry. So when the people are back at home, it all connects. The birds, mum, family, tribe, the river, mountain, creation. We're all connected as one again. So we're not objects. We're not possessions for people's entertainment. We're real people with real feelings, and we need to respect the living. But not only respect the living, we need to respect the people that are gone. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd also just want to pay my respect as well. Thank you for having us. It's a real honour for us to be visiting here on your country and to share this story from Australia. You know, I'd like to acknowledge your ancestors and everyone's ancestors here as well, and my ancestors who are also here. And you know, it's a really beautiful thing to see so many people coming together, and thank you all for having all of us and bringing us together, bringing us our energy, our spirit together, and so that we can learn from each other. My name's John Harvey, and I'm the writer of The Return. And this is a little odd for me, standing here. Normally, you know, we talk through our work and not necessarily about the work too much, but I want to try and share the experience of creating a work from archival material. Some of you might have seen the film Still We Rise the other night that I directed, and I did that project and this project, The Return, last year. So I was very much in that archival space, and that's kind of where my energy sat all year. I did some other projects as well, but it was very much there. I was very much in a space, as Jason was saying, of honouring our ancestors and feeling a huge amount of responsibility in what and how we were telling this story. But for me, I guess, you know, who I am is, you know, I'm the son of Norma Harvey, and she's my mum. She's passed away now, but she's from Saibai Island in the Torres Strait, which is in the very north of Australia, and come from, it's a low-lying island. It's only 1.2 metres high and is one of those islands that is under threat from rising sea levels. So when I was thinking about the theme and how we hold the past, how we live today in the present, I'm certainly a product of that diaspora. And holding these stories and carrying these stories. And my dad is from England, and he met my mother right up in Cape York. He was working with my mother's father, and then started seeing my mother. And at that time, they had to get the permission of the chief protector to get married, because in Queensland, it was under the Act, and there was an Act that controlled where you lived. You couldn't just leave where you lived. You had to get permission of the chief protector. If you wanted to get married, you had to get permission from the chief protector. I guess I share that because, this is kind of how we got to be here today. And, I think stories are a very funny thing. We accumulate stories in our lives. Our stories start before us, and we accumulate them in our lives. And these little pieces, and as a writer, you're collecting pieces in your life, tiny little fragments of stories, and you don't know when they're going to make sense. And we're having this chat the other night, and that's why I really admire what you do in your work, is you kind of put those away, and they come out at times when they need to be spoken, when that voice needs to be heard. For me, years ago, I went with my mother to Cambridge University, and Cambridge University had gone to the Torres Strait in the 1800s, and I think it's actually where they started the practice of anthropology. So at that time, they started actually recording who said things and associating it with people. And it was also a time, I guess, of change. And so for us to see some of those things from Saibai, was very special. We also went to the University of London, and the London Missionary Society was also in the Torres Strait in the late 1800s. And, there were records there about people's experiences. And on my grandfather's tribe is Samu, which is a cassowary, and that's our totem. And on my grandmother's side, it's the Aitkadal clan, and the totem for that is a crocodile. And, that side of the family they moved into the village of Saibai under, Christianity was sweeping through the Torres Strait at the time. And on the crocodile clan side, they were one of the last clan groups to move in. And the church there was built from coral, which, some of the buildings here are built from. And I think, reading those records, reading the words of those white men who had been on the island, I was just fascinated, like, so what's the other side of the story? What was happening there, and why did that happen? And it was just all of those questions, what are those stories between the lines that we don't get to hear, that we don't get to read? And going on to do the return, I had that same process, and you sit in the material, and we come from an oral storytelling tradition. And so when you're in the archive, you're reading other people's words of your own people. And, you're wanting to fill in those spaces, you're wanting to bring and lift those voices out. And, I think that was a real kind of challenge with this piece on a personal level. It was about how do we extract that, and then how do I kind of shape that into a story? This is a story that spans over 250 years. It involves, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities right across the country. And it's not just a national story, but it's an international story. And as Jason was saying, there was a trade around, really trafficking ancestral remains. So that was a challenge for me as a writer, and I think as a writer in a creative process, you're just kind of, It's kind of a spiritual journey and an instinctive journey, and you're responding to the material. And it's been really wonderful listening to everyone speak this week. And I have to apologise, like, I'm not an academic. I sometimes the words, I don't quite understand what they mean, but I could see that the way you approach your work and the framework in which you think about it was kind of similar to how our creative process was. You know, we use different language, we have a different way of guiding ourselves through that to bring story out, but eventually we arrive at a very similar place. And I think that's a really fascinating thing, and I'm grateful for those conversations of everyone before us. Just to give you a feel, you saw the trailer. I'm just going to play like a couple of minutes of the show right at the head of the show, just to give you a feel for that. I think I'm going to do that.
What? What is it? Hilda? Hilda!
Museum natives, this is your 5-minute call. This is your 5-minute call. The Museum of Origins will open in 5 minutes. The Museum of Origins will open in 5 minutes. Please take your place.
Look at this! It's filthy!
I'm sorry.
So we set the show up in a place called the Museum of Origins. So that's it. And what I wanted to do as a storyteller, you know, we're not educators, you know, we're artists, we're storytellers, and it's important for us to connect with the audience, you know, and to take them on an emotional journey. You know, I remember reading this quote one time, Werner Herzog, the documentary maker, it was facts do not constitute the truth. And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting thing. Because here we are talking about a story that had a kind of a group of people who were searching for facts to tell the truth, you know? They were turning away from religion, they were turning away from understanding the world through cosmology, and thought man can measure everything in the world. You know, man has that ability. And in that, they came crashing into a very spiritual people, you know, who were spiritual people having a physical existence here. And, you know, I just thought that was a really fascinating thing. Jason spoke about when he would repatriate ancestors back home, one of the last things they would do was to, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, bro, yeah, is burn the boxes, you know, and they'd burn the boxes, and the labels would be on the boxes, and that would disappear. You know, no longer were our people framed in a particular way, being defined in a particular way, and there was that release for their spirits. And I think, you know, these kind of things, like from a writing perspective, I try to hold. You know, in reading this material, in any archival material, it's very difficult. It's a hard thing reading very violent stories. You know, for me, I could never take it home, for example, into my house where my family slept. I always kept it at my office, and I didn't want those stories anywhere near me, you know, or under the roof of my home, rather, you know, and I found myself writing and then having to go for a walk. I had an office near a river, and I could just go for a walk and step away from those stories. And we have to remember, like, we're talking the early 1900s in Australia, and it's still a very violent, brutal colony and front. And at that time, you know, there was this growing kind of eugenics happening, which was happening around the world. In Australia, it was no different. So there was a Eugenics Society of Victoria, and, you know, it was all about this, you know, profitable, developing a strong nation of people. And, you know, so we had that. We had Darwin's theory of evolution, which had the Australian Aboriginal as the closest relation to the ape. And coincidentally, at the other end was the white Anglo male. And, you know, so this justification and drive to prove that scientific theory was extraordinary. And I think part of it, probably thinking for people, is Australia's this little colony down under, a long way from England and the prestigious universities of over in Europe. And so for, you know, the ego gets in the way, and, you know, people want to get a name for themselves. So I think, you know, in the University of Melbourne and the anatomists who existed there, you know, were driven by this, and driven by this desire to prove a theory. And they would pack out, in Melbourne, they would pack out halls like this when they spoke about their theory. They were like rock stars of today, you know. And so I think, you know, you think about it in that context, you think that this time people were still going out on what they call the clearing expeditions. So that's essentially a group of men riding out on their horses with rifles and shooting tribes of people, you know, women, children and men, and just hunting people down and massacring them. And, you know, people would then sell those remains to museums, to universities, and they would then trade that with each other, you know, and the fresher the remain, the more money they would get. So there was a pricing index for what would be done, and, you know, so we're talking thousands and thousands of ancestors traded all around the world in the name of science. You know, part of this process of coming into the play was spending a lot of time with Jason, because he'd worked in repatriation. And I was curious. I thought, how does this brother hold the weight of that? How do you sit with that? You know, how do you sit with the responsibility of trying to return fragments of ancestors back home? How do you hold that as you're walking down the street, as you're talking to communities where they've had so much taken from them, and the discussion around returning of ancestors brings up a lot of emotions for people. You know, so in that role, you sometimes, you know, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and, you know, you have to walk a solo journey for the sake of communities, for the sake of ancestors. And, you know, there's a lot of research that's done to get people home. So I spoke in the process, you know, spoke to Jason a lot. We had lots of conversations, and that was my question, and I wanted to feel that, and I wanted to see how we could bring that to the show. He took us. We went on a trip, a recce trip, as part of our creative development. We went to the museum's storage facility. You know, and just seeing, you know, this massive warehouse with all of these things in there. And that was kind of giving me a feel, I guess, and giving us a feel for what this show might be, how we might kind of tell the story. He took us up to where he had done a repatriation, and that was a very special experience, being there. And I think, you know, because I'd read material, and it was, you know, I think just to sit in that space with Jason, with his family there, and connect on a very deep and spiritual way was really important to take that away. And another thing as a writer, I would just say is, like, it's a really dark story. It's really hard. It was hard for me to sit in it as a writer. And so, you know, part of the crafting as well is how do you, because nobody wants to sit for an hour and a half in just one very dark place. You know, you have to bring in kind of emotions, and, you know, there's this thing about joy, and joy being an act of resilience, and I just love that. And I'm not sure if I spoke about it the other night, but in a story like this, the nature of the story is this conflict with the colonizer. And then what can happen because of that is you start defining yourself based on the colonizer. And you're in your own way kind of disempowering yourself, because you're giving all of this power to the colonizer, you know, of all of these things, but haven't survived for 60,000 years by doing that. And so I think there's something about humour within all cultures that intimately connects people together, and that isn't based on the other, isn't based on the colonizer. And so for me, that was really important, because, you know, like, there were very hard moments being on this trip, but there was also, like, I haven't laughed so hard for so long, all within the one trip, you know, and that is the mirrored of kind of emotions and how we are as human beings, and those are important things to find connection. You know, and the other thing about repatriation, which I spoke to Jason a lot about, was in returning ancestors, there's only bits of information, because everybody records it differently. So it takes a lot of investigation work to find out where those remains come from, their provenance, you know. And it takes everybody. And so a farmer might find something on their country, and, you know, it's like that person may think different politically. They might not even have any relationship with Indigenous people or care. They might be racist, you know, but in order to return back an ancestor to home, the communication has to be open. If there is judgment, it's as simple as that person saying, "I've found remains," and calling up the Heritage Council. And if there's judgment by that other person, that person can hang up the phone, and that ancestor will never be returned home. And so in writing this story, I was really aware that what it took for us as a country is to come around together in this truth-telling space. and to be able to hold space and have conversations. You know, there's a lot of hurt around it, but we have to come together in order to get, you know, our people home. So those were kind of important things. And then just from a, you know, having the Museum of Origins, just from a technical point of view, allowed us to play with this story that jumped across 250 years, because an object would spark a memory, and then we just go back in time, you know, and that way we're taking out this idea that time is linear, you know, it's this construct, you know, and by collapsing time, we could make that kind of, these feelings more present for the audience and to make it a more of a visceral, immediate experience. This screen went red a little while ago, so I'm just going to have a look at this. Yeah, and so I think that's probably all I want to say for now, and we'll have time for questions and more discussion at the end. Yeah, great. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
I also want to thank the Sharjah Arts Foundation and everyone for having us here. It's been an extraordinary week. The March meeting, I want to come back. I'm also going to speak about, obviously, the return. My name's Matt Lutton. I was the co-director of the return with Jason Tamiru, but I'm also the artistic director and co-CEO of the institution that commissioned and premiered the play called The Malthouse. So I'd like to speak about rehearsing and creating this work from the point of view of being a co-director and a commissioning company, and speak about some of the complexities of being an established arts institution in Australia when supporting stories and performers that are championing decolonisation. So firstly, some context. Malthouse Theatre has been performing in Melbourne and around the world for about more than 45 years. We're based in an old maltings factory in Melbourne, hence the name. We're one of the 28 major performing arts organisations in Australia, and we premiere about 10 productions a year, so we're a very busy company. We're the second largest company in Melbourne, and this means that we've established being the alternative thinker on the main stage. Our ambition as a theatre company is to offer provocation, to create theatre that often asks sometimes controversial ideas and questions in hope of sparking conversation. And we're always trying to ask, what about theatre itself? What are the stories we should be telling? Who should be telling them? And how should they be told? At the Malthouse, we have a history of collaborating with First Nation artists and stories, through commissioning and supporting Indigenous writers to write new plays, as well as supporting teams of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists to come together and collaborate. But as a company, we certainly still do not do enough. There's still a lot more work to be done in Australia to bring the truth of the past into the present and to find honest and genuine reconciliation. It's worth pointing out that the Malthouse is still an institution. And as an institution, when presenting Indigenous stories, there are always questions about who are we telling this story for? Are they for First Nation audiences? Are they for non-Indigenous allies? For those who have yet to be awakened to the true history in Australia? Or those who have contradictory views? We also have to consider that by presenting theatre that is actively talking about historical trauma, it is often traumatising for those hearing or reliving the stories in the present. Therefore, what is the responsibility of care for an institution when sharing traumatic truths? How do we care for the performers who are expressing their culture on stage, but we're also asking them to embody trauma repeatedly under the gaze of an audience? These are some of the questions we were and continue to wrestle with while creating the return. The beginning of the return was Jason Tamiru. It's about his experiences and drawing from his experiences of working in repatriation. Jason was already working at the Malthouse as a producer, and he approached both myself and the executive producer about his experiences in repatriation and suggested that this is a story that needed to be told. On reflection, this is a remarkable moment as Jason approached us as a main stage company, as an institution, and expressed trust. He was trusting the Malthouse as a company to support a complex cultural story. And it's without Jason's trust, without this offer from him, that the story and production would never have occurred. The time to create and develop the return was quite different to the time and pace I was used to, and it was different to the rhythm that our institution works at. As a director, I've directed many new plays. I've seen plays written rapidly. I've seen plays that have taken years to be written. I've seen plays that completely backflip and reinvent themselves while being created, and those that realise precisely what they set out to achieve from the very first conversation. For the return, I was taught to be patient, to listen and to wait, and to not force the story into a direction or process it didn't naturally flow. A lot of the history in the return I'd never heard of before. I was confronting my own ignorance, so I was learning from Jason and John and history continuously. And I often had to separate my desire to turn everything I was learning into theatre, but instead to sit with the truth, its weight, and wait for the theatre to emerge. I've only been making work at major institutions for the last 15 years, so my artistic process, while being very personal and my own, inevitably works with and within an institutional rhythm. For the return, I and the company, we really needed to resist this tempo. Asking this story to evolve in an institutional rhythm would harm the soul of the work. So as a company, we needed to work in a different way. The casting of this production, bringing together the right performers, was fundamental to the development of what you've seen here in the video to tell the return. And it required time and a significant amount of time. Not only were we seeking 6 Indigenous or Torres Strait performers who are brilliant actors, we were also looking for performers with different cultural experiences and backgrounds that could bring their individual culture to the work itself. The constellation of cultural wisdom in the ensemble was vital, and it took nearly 18 months of meeting performers from around the country to find and bring together the right team. How we met these performers, how we introduced the ideas to them, how trust was built and exchanged was just one of the many processes that needed to be different. But as a result, we found an extraordinary team of actors, dancers and storytellers, all who brought their enormous insight and wisdom to the work. I've skipped a few slides. The set design created by Zoe Atkinson and Chloe Ogilvie took about 4 years to evolve. John was writing a play that was post-dramatic in form, not that we ever used that word while we were talking about it. There was no unity of time and space as location was porous. Time would change with every scene, time was spherical, and multiple realities would exist on stage. Of course, most of the traits we can talk about with post-dramatic theatre can all be seen in First Nations storytelling long, long before the word drama was ever coined. Post-dramatic theatre might like to think that its non-linear intertextual forms have been new in the last 70 years, but Indigenous storytellers in Australia have been embodying this approach to storytelling, especially in the form of songlines, long, long before the term playwright was spoken. John's play requires, though, a theatrical space that could hold a story, a space that could transform in your imagination, as it would be impossible and undesirable to realise every location in every scene in the play in realistic terms. We needed and wanted a transformative space. This led to what's a very common practice in theatre of distilling the ideas down to core scenography gestures. For the return, this became a concentration of 2 symbols. The first to represent country or land, and the second, colonial imposition or colonial scars. The the designers decide to fill the theatre, as you can see in the video, with black soil, but an unnaturally black soil. A material that was tactile, moved under the actor's feet, that you could dig deeply into, that made your footsteps quiet, but also didn't signify a specific country. It wasn't the soil you could find in the north, south, or west of Australia, all which have different types of country. It was a symbolic soil, a gesture of the universal idea of country beneath our feet. For the colonial symbol, we were talking about large white plinths that sit on this earth. Originally, we had the very ambitious idea that we would build white plinths as seating banks for the audience. So the entire audience was viewing from colonial structures. And then at the conclusion of the production, when the repatriation ceremony was to occur, the audience would be invited to walk onto the soil, stand together as one with the performers, and the seating banks magically would retract into the theatre walls, taking the colonial symbol with them. Not surprisingly, we couldn't afford to do this, but it also created a problem with the honesty of our story. At the end of the return, colonialism hasn't been removed. A repatriation has occurred, healing has occurred, but not all healing. There's more work to be done. Therefore, it felt naive to visually suggest that at the end of this story, the oppression of colonialism was entirely removed. The design therefore evolved to the theatre being front-on, and a train track was added, as you can see in these pictures, that encircles the soil, scarring and encircling country, becoming a conveyor of all the white plinths. This also became our symbol of industry, and while the production concluded with incredible beauty and healing, the track remains. This production also required the integration of culture into storytelling and staging, and this took its own time and rhythm of investigation. I'll just mention 3 areas of culture that were part of the production that needed this consideration. The first was acknowledging that we were telling a story that had at its conclusion a cultural ceremony. We wanted it to be moving for an audience, an authentic emotional experience, but it isn't appropriate or safe to perform a real cultural burial ceremony on a stage. A theatre isn't a place for sacred ceremonies. Therefore, again, we needed to work with symbolism. The second was the decision to invite 2 non-actors to join the cast on stage for the cultural ceremony, a cultural dancer and a musician. This was breaking down the dramaturgy of having actors playing characters on stage. When the ceremony occurred, 2 new performers emerged who were not acting, they were themselves, sharing dance and music as both a symbolic repatriation ceremony within the story and as a ceremony for everyone in the theatre that night to bring the performance to a conclusion. At the end of the show, there was no longer characters on stage, only people. And the music and the dance was deeply necessary to help everyone leave the theatre and carry the story with them, and to help everyone walk lightly. Thirdly, cultural clothing was worn in the production and referred to in the script. I think you saw a little bit, you see the image there, but you saw it very briefly in the video when the performers come out. For this to be authentic and not be an appropriated version of cultural objects was a long process. The performers were invited to look at the cultural clothing from their own communities and were asked if they wanted to wear that clothing on stage. Some of the actors came from communities where there was already a protocol in place for what was appropriate to wear on stage, a theatrical version of cultural clothing approved by their elders. And these actors could immediately speak to their communities for guidance. Other performers didn't have this connection to communities, so they were guided by Jason and the costume designer on how to create their clothing. Every piece of clothing needed to be considered individually and personally, so the performers and the production were confident permission had been gained for this clothing to be shared on stage. Another difference in this production was the concept of co-directors, of an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous artist coming together. It was important from the beginning that we were clear on who would have final say if there was ever a moment of differing views. And this was easy to answer. It was Jason. He has an understanding and vision of this story I can never have. And he absolutely needed to be the person who would make always the final call. It's also important that there was transparency between Jason and I, of course, but also with the entire team about what areas of the production that we would be focusing on. Jason would lead all the cultural elements of the performance, the story and the production, and I would support and guide the theatre technical craft of the work. It would be a bringing together of culture and theatre, helping us make sure that both aspects of the production and story were well cared for and supported. Care was also incredibly important in the rehearsal room for this piece. And part of the care was about creating rehearsal rituals that allowed the performers and makers to enter and then exit traumatic subject material. Jason Tamiru, in his wisdom, introduced a ritual to the beginning and end of every rehearsal day to help the performers know that they were only going to enter these emotional narratives for the 8 hours that we rehearsed, and then they could leave this emotion in the room and not take it home with them. It was a physical and symbolic ritual that helped the body realise that when leaving the physical space, you could also leave the emotional and psychological space. A major part of any rehearsal process involves entering fully into the emotional experience of the story and then finding a way to turn this into a performance score that doesn't require you to fully engage with the emotion every time you repeat the scene for an audience. This process was even more important for the return. To traumatise yourself on stage repeatedly, to articulate horrific truths to an audience, can traumatise the performer. But there is always a way to perform this material that doesn't harm the actors. For example, in The Return, there is a scene, maybe sort of a split second of it, where one of the actors, Guy Simons, needs to perform a moment where he is repeatedly shot by a coloniser. The moment was performed about 12 times on stage in a loop to evoke a massacre. For the audience, it was deeply distressing. But for Guy, as a performer, it needed to only be a physical task. For him, we needed to create a physical ritual that he could repeat without entering the emotional endowment of trauma. So when Guy was performing this scene, from his perspective, he was not being shot, but performing a physical task of running, stopping and falling. He didn't have to feel the emotion of being hunted. This was the effect of the physical action on the audience, but it didn't have to have the affect on him to have impact. He could emotionally protect himself and be confident that he didn't have to embody the trauma for this effect to be offered to the audience. As a side note, you can see a lot of intersection here between rehearsal methodology and the treatment of trauma in psychotherapy, where it is vital to be able to articulate the experience and the narrative experience of what is happening to you, what is happening to your body and mind, so that you can understand what is happening and then hopefully control what is happening to you emotionally, as opposed to experiencing trauma as overwhelming and debilitating. I'm going to conclude there and say that The Return, for me, is an incredibly important work in Australia about repatriation, about living with the past in the present, but has also been a production that impacted and changed the way an institution was working. And as an artist, it has shifted my own way of working and thinking. It is therefore a story and a play that is having a multitude of impacts, and one which I carry with me very closely and dearly. Thank you.
Check. Thank you, Jason Tamiru, John Harvey, and Matt. Jason Tamiru, the word Tamiru in Amharic means the incredible. And today I told him, do you know that it means in Amharic, the incredible? He said to me that my father is an Ethiopian. So, let's, you know, I enjoyed reading the script, watching the play. We can see what performance does in terms of, you know, engaging with these kinds of accumulated injuries. So you have given us so much today to think about. John, earlier you said that, you know, you were apologizing a little bit that, you know, it might not be sounding like academic. I think academics should learn so many things from these kinds of processes. I mean, you know, March meeting should also rethink its formulation of, you know, the keynote and the lecture, you know, because these kinds of stuff have been considered by academics as data to be analyzed by them, awaiting their analysis, you know. This is an intellectual process. So how can we submit to these kinds of, you know, thinking processes, creative processes, the ways in which John have been reading the archive? I think it's, you know, gives us a fresh insight about engaging with the archive, which has been taken very seriously by academics most of the time, you know. So it is so refreshing in many ways. I would like to not to frame and reframe what has been done and what have you given us today, but by way of inviting us all to engage with these kinds of, you know, lived experiences and the question of reparation, repatriation, and restitution. Today in the morning session, we did not say, you know, anything about human remains. It was about the object. It was about the artifact. So what kind of, you know, light would it shed if we really think from the side of like ancestral human remains about the dehumanization process? How can it would really help us to think about the question of reparation particularly in a different way? And how can also multi-genre performances? Here I would like to appreciate Hural Kasimi, who have brought both in the panel and the March meeting with this critical creative curating. Multi-genre performances have been really part of this, you know, artistic processes. So what would like these performances offer in understanding in the world and in changing it? I think that would be one way of, you know, going about it. The other thing is, John, you talked about like collapsing the time. And you have been speaking about, you know, how we should defy this linear temporality. But I think for me, the question of reparation, repatriation, and restitution have been confined to the museum and to the objects. So what would happen to these ideas when we start the discussion from the museum? When we end, you know, our solution at the museum, be it the fixed museum or the nomadic museum, as much as it is like liberating, but we end up, you know, confining ourselves in the museum and with those objects. So this also raises a historiographic question in a sense that we say, when you talk about these issues, we say that it is past injuries, you know, looted in the past. So we are locking temporality in the past by not allowing us to think with the past, to engage with the past from the present, right? I think looting should be understood in a capacious way. The first thing looted from the black body is humanity, right? So then black bodies have been denied their movement in time, their movement in spaces, So they are mere nature. They cannot even understand their surroundings, so someone can come and take their natural resources. So that looting, which started in that very body, has continued in many ways. The looting of the natural resources, the land, and the continuous looting of labor from the black body. As Fanon says, the white man does not want to reciprocate. He does not want to acknowledge. What he wants is the labor from that black body, right? So it has continued. The incarceration, the structural racism, capitalism, heteropatriarchal regimes. So for us to think about reparation, I think we need to come out of that shell so that we can have this expansive understanding which may not demand us to, again, to start discussion about the post-restitution after everything is, becomes, already late. So I think it is time to understand that. When we come back to Australia, people dying in the police custody, the black immigrants who are suffering in the system, and to be particular in the arts institutions, white institutions have, dominated the art scene. So what does it mean to bring these kinds of, performances into these spaces, and what does it mean to reconfigure and reimagine these art spaces? So with this, I would like to open the floor. It's not a question. You are not expected to answer to any of them. You can reflect on them later on, maybe. With this, I would like to open the floor to all of you. Here we have two young ladies in the front.
Thank you. We had to type up our questions because they are just compounding, so we're going to do our best. Thank you all so much for your work, truly. I think we had lunch together and got to kind of peek at what this could be. And I think both of us being in performance spaces are just, and thinking through futurity, this is, it's really a gift, so thank you. I love the mention of the idea of freeing ourselves from being locked in temporalities. I think that's kind of been touched on by each of you. And there's this immense responsibility in channeling ancestral stories and imagining futures at the same time, particularly when working through deep pain, and I think a lot of us in this room are kind of sourcing that pain. There was mention of both collapsing time and then grappling with the naiveness of suggesting that colonialism has ended, as Matthew said, versus giving people kind of like a hint or like a glance at what the future would look like if you did. And I'm curious about how you all navigate the choice of how to demonstrate futurity and what kinds of questions you all were considering when writing this out and doing so.
I'll add to that, and then pass it back to you guys. We do everything together, I'm sorry. I just wanted to echo Tatiana's words. Thank you so much. We learned so much. You kept echoing that you're not academics, but I learned the most from this. So thank you so much. It was incredible. I want to add to that question by kind of introducing kind of the variable of thinking about kind of in a communal and a collectivist kind of space. How do you introduce and include kind of intergenerational work? How do you involve other generations into the, like, younger and older, into that process of kind of reimagining and imagining futurity? I'm really curious to hear about that, because I think it reflects a lot in the work that we want to do, just thinking about the future, thinking about the past, and thinking about how all the generations really need to be included in that conversation. So how do you do more of that?
And the last thing, this is just a side note. Matthew, I really appreciate the mention of like white people organizing white people. Because I actually think as an infrastructure and needing support for these kinds of works, it's a big thing. And I just want to say, yeah, shout out. I appreciate that.
To get more questions and then reflect upon later, or? Okay. Okay, please.
So thank you. Thanks for those questions. And yeah, I guess about accessibility is kind of a thing, like for me, like when I think about young people, and because often these archives are very inaccessible, and you know they're they're not accessible for families, and you know, and it's locked up. You know, that history, as incorrect as it may be, it's locked up. And you know, I think for us this is kind of a right of reply to that so-called, you know, documented history. And you know, I think for me, just within the process, I'm very much trying to think about just the flow of the story and then how people can engage within that. And, you know, certainly within the process of creating a show, you know, we're in the room with actors, you know, and we're in the room with the young actors, and we're getting that feedback and getting that, you know, is this resonating? Is it connecting? And, you know, and you know, we're opening up this door. And I just on that too, part of this process for the actors was, what was important was for every part of those stories, there's a backstory to that, you know, and they're often very horrific stories. And it was really important to protect the actors from that. You know, they're there to embody a role and to explore that, and we want them to bring their creativity to that. And so, you know, so we didn't necessarily share you know, all of the backstories with things. So we just allowed, you know, so that they could have the script, work on that, and go step away from it. And that was really important to us. Sorry, I'm not sure if I've answered your question. I think Jason's going to talk.
Yeah, just quickly, I guess, it was a nice lunch. It's lovely speaking to you both. Going forward and acknowledging the past, I feel strongly that the world wants to turn the page. I really feel strongly in that, and people are finding it difficult to turn that page. They don't know how to. So to turn the page, sometimes what you've got to do, you got to go back. And we all carry, all of us, we all carry memory within our bodies. And it's not just from when we're born, it's when our grandfathers are born, and grandparents, and it keeps going on, you know? And those memories, they sit inside all of us. And what society does, it tricks us. It makes us forget or oppress that memory. And especially old people, long life. I picked up a lot of good and bad. So what we do in going forward is you provide an opportunity for healing, you know? And most people want to heal. So you give that opportunity of healing, and that's healing of that DNA memory of you and your grandparents and all your generations. It's screaming for healing to go forward. So when the opportunity comes, people take it. And that's what repatriation does. It brings people with all different lives to a moment of going forward. And everyone at the ceremonial ground are in tears because of that trauma. And even to the collector, curator, person who had invested thousands of dollars in their practice, in their belief system of what's right and wrong. But you take them to that emotional place and you stimulate that memory. It's an outpouring of grief. And I don't mind crying, as you're saying. I love it. Because it's who I am, you know. And I like bringing people to that. And I guess for me, with the trauma, I carry it. And it's heaps. It's a lot, you know. But that's my human right. You know what I mean? It's my human right. The world tells me that I've got to forget it. Not be sad. Not be angry. Not be, you know, peed off with everything and disgust. So that channel's open for me. I carry those feelings every day. And I do so because that's my right. That's what I'm born with. And I've learned by going there, makes me a better person for now and for tomorrow. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
We have about 26 minutes. So, okay, my brother behind. Okay. Oh, sorry. I didn't see it. Oh, okay. We'll come to you next.
Okay, thank you very much for the very, very powerful panel. I'm an academic and based in the Netherlands, in the former metropole. And my question is that of an academic. So please, if you don't care about those questions, just say, look, it's your problem. We are trying to do sort of precisely to address the issues that you were talking about in terms of the problems of academia producing knowledge that is not only outdated, but also really not suitable for, not very helpful for bringing us forward in many ways. And we are trying to experiment along the lines of bringing together, let's say, academia and performance, artistic research, and experimenting with that in the classroom. And I was wondering whether you have experience working with schools and particularly universities, whether that your performance is accessible, and whether you're interested, whether you think that the university can be saved, if you wish, as a space for, you know, thinking otherwise about those issues for teaching restitutions, and if you do that, how you do that, and if you can give us some advice.
I can try and answer some of those questions. Certainly when we were performing the return in Australia, the idea of engaging with educational institutions and schools was a huge part of the project. That was about, one, attending the production and discussions and facilitating it, so that there's, in many ways, that the play is used as a starting point for ongoing conversations. We provide a lot of accessibility to it. I think Jason was going out and talking to various groups. So we always, I guess we build that in as a foundation of when we're making the work. We don't really have much connection with educational institutions in a big way. This guy is just now starting to work at one, so maybe we can talk about that in a sec. So I don't quite know how that relationship between an arts organisation and a university can grow. I'm sorry.
I do. Yeah. You can probably tell I go for it. Yeah, don't put a door in front of me because I'll smash it down. For equality and justice, all the way. Universities and academia, and I guess people that work in them, you know, they want to have a break. What I'm getting at is, it's only so long that you can portray or continue an act. Especially when it comes to First Nations people, you know. In universities and the lecturers and so on, you know, they're seen as, you know, with respectfully, the experts. You know? They go through, you know, years of shaping to become educators within their field, you know, and they educate their people with the knowledge that they know, you know. But what about First Nations information? In the academic world, they've only got their education from a book, and they haven't got relationships with our community, or through with our ceremony or culture or law, or that diamond law that I shown, you know. So at the beginning, a few years ago, they put up really big doors. It was difficult to smash down. But things have changed. The door's smashed down. And what's completely been a turnaround for me is the recent opportunity of me working in the university. Like, what? This is a prestigious university in the crime scene, which is Australia. I don't call it Australia, I call it a crime scene. And I guess the opportunity came up for where they wanted the voice of a First Nations person. And they contacted me. And so I started working in the university, and what's my role? Decolonise. The university has connected with academia, even from a First Nations perspective, and that's one voice. But what about everyone else? And I'm fortunate enough to have, and privileged that I'm able to sit in the center of many worlds. And like a person who works on traffic, you know, guiding the traffic around, I'm able to connect the dots. So I'm going to be in a position of bringing new voices into academia that have the principles of culture and law and, you know, love and ceremony and connection and integrity and all those things, but very much grounded in on the earth. And what I mean by grounded, it's speaking a language that people can understand. So the universities are changing, you know. They are shifting, but it's got a lot of work to do. But like I said before, there's this fire inside of people, and I want to put it out because ignorance can only last so long. It suffocates you, and even the university world, it's, you know, they're feeding on themselves, you know, and it's like, yo, I need to get out. I need to need to turn the page. I need something else to. So when I communicate, I can communicate to what is a modern world, as opposed to a world of the past. And I come from a long history, but I'm a modern thinker. Understand what I'm saying? I'm the flip of the world. You know, the river might run one way, but I run the other. And that's the current, how it operates. And, you know, things are starting to catch up a little bit now. So yeah, it takes a little bit of work, but yeah, things are changing now. I enjoy it because I enjoy meeting different people, talking to different people, and, you know, I said at the beginning of my talk was we didn't get the opportunity to communicate, to find our identity. It's be written by others. And what people are learning is a lie. And no educator wants to be part of that. What are you going to be educating your kids or the next generation? The world's growing. We're moving forward. And people need to get in that carriage and go that way, you know? So the universities, you've got to step your game up. We've got to move forward. And by doing so, it's making an inclusive education system that's for everyone, so we all can move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very powerful panel and beautifully moderated also. So thank you for that. You know, this is a question that's kind of troubled me for a long time, and really it's the first time I'm getting an opportunity to ask this, which is that we know the catalog of violence of, well, 400 years, if not longer, by colonialism. And that entails an epistemological violence where various other epistemologies are subjugated, erased, and annihilated. But obviously, it's a delusion that it's completely annihilated because it's not annihilated. It still lives. So on the one hand, we know how other epistemologies get subjugated and registered within, for a convenient term, within colonial epistemology. And I've always wondered how the reverse is also happening, how other epistemologies register the colonial violent epistemology. And like, how do the other cosmologies register this? And on the one hand, one hears stories such as, or narratives which usually take the form of an interruption of a cosmology based on colonial violence. But from what I saw today, it felt like this is sort of how it registers within another cosmology, that one epistemology registering in another cosmology as opposed to interrupting a cosmology, and therefore that now has to resume. So I wanted to ask what your thought might be in relation to a certain cosmology/epistemology, whether you feel it gets interrupted with what has happened over the past 400 years, or whether it gets registered and what happens with that registration. When I ask or see this with, or try to raise this with some people who I have access to, it starts turning into a kind of right-wing discussion. That, no, we need to build museums which also perform like temples. And that sort of becomes troubling, that those temples can then have another exclusionary, violent thing, especially in some contexts, such as in India. So I wanted to ask this question in this meandering way of, do you see a cosmology/epistemology in a work like this registering the other, or do you feel it kind of is a way of repudiating the other? You know? I hope that makes sense. It's sort of like what John mentioned about seeing yourself through the framework of the colonizer. And, you know, when one does not do that through a different epistemology, what happens?
Thank you so much to the woman who was about to ask. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you want to try and show? Oh, sorry.
Hello, how are you? I want to ask a question in terms of African Americans and the conversations that were going before about reparations and things. And the problem that happens is there is no authentic place to go to in that context. So what would your recommendations be for people who are a bunch of different tribes or whatever, who are mixed, who don't know where they come from and things like that? Because when you talked about the cultural costumes, it registered in my mind like that. Thank you.
I actually think I have to confess my ignorance. I don't know what epistemology is, so you'll have to. I'm sorry. I think I understand what you're saying about the lens, or about what happens when a culture is interrupted by another culture, and then which lens you might take when telling a story. I don't know. You have to reframe the question. Is that?
Would you like briefly to just recap what you said?
Are you talking about the collision? Yeah, the collision.
And one assuming that it can erase the other, but actually it hasn't. So when it hasn't, the other is also registering the other, and what happens to this epistemological kind of, life.
Right.
Yeah. Just from a story sense, for me, it's really important for me to, I think I said it earlier about the perspective of how we tell our stories. And I'm just very aware that, as soon as you start to frame it based on the other, then you can kind of give power to that. And so, and that's a tricky thing too, because that is a discussion that everybody wants to hear, because it perpetuates exactly what you're saying, and there can be a false sense of healing, but within that structure and that relationship with that material or with that story, it keeps it framed in a particular way. And so for me as a storyteller, it's really important to go, I understand that's there, but I'm going to sit with this energy and story over this way. And I think I would just say I think the lady's gone now, but just in regards to, I think, what is the relationship and the power dynamic? And I guess, I appreciate, we all come from different disciplines. And I think, as we work with archive material, it's that acknowledgement that we're kind of in a position of power. I, as a writer, am in a position of power. And we have to be very aware of that and aware of the language that we use. And I think, as a writer, creative writer, the process you're going through is trying to open yourself up and trying to let that flow through and that story flow through. And, sometimes words can become weapons, and they help us feel a sense of strength within a discussion. And I think, it's important, whatever we're doing, whether we're creative writers or academics writers, you know, that we kind of have those moments where we reflect on that. You know, often for me, in looking at the archive material, and there's a photograph which I might just show, actually, if I could have access to the piece. Are we able to have the, oh, thank you, great. So just, you know, I think, because I think what was interesting for me was often people's observations about people showed more about the power dynamic and how that sat than actually what was being played out. And I think that that's a general thing that we find in telling these stories, and that's what we're trying to do is exactly reclaim the stories. So, like, for example, this photograph was one that I came across, and you know, you can see, like, that says very little about the people in it, you know, and it says much, much more about the person who took that image. You know, the way that image is framed, the language that that photographer came with to make sense of these people is the thing that frames that, you know, and you know, and what they're wearing, the kangaroo on the ground. The kangaroo has a boomerang in his hand. I don't know if you can notice that. You know, so it says very little about the image. And, you know, obviously that photographer hasn't kind of had that conversation about what is it, or kind of sat in a deep listening way. And I think that that's a literal illustration of it through a photograph, but the material is full of that, you know, and you know, for me as a writer, I couldn't believe that photo, first of all, and I found it fascinating to think about how it got to that position. So we had a scene that was kind of around that, you know, that then collapsed into a scene of a massacre, and it's this photographer who shoots photos for GQ and Vogue and everything. So it's in this contemporary sense, taking this photo and positioning the natives and going perfect, and then it changes, and then that camera, there's a shotgun noise, and then there's this violence that's being carried out. And you know what? Part of the thing of this too was to not sit in the scenes too long. You know, that this violence has been continuous, it's been relentless for 250 years, so in a dramatic sense, we just keep it rolling. You know, you're on to the next scene, you're on to somewhere else, you're trying to position and feel where you are, but we keep moving it, you know? We keep moving and have the audience experience that feeling of being dispossessed, pushed off your land, you know? And I think those kind of things are really important. So I guess, you know, thinking academically too, it's that language, you know, and because this is a story where language was determined, the science was weaponized, it placed people in a very, very powerful position that could then influence social policy, which was obviously a massive disconnect. And that's where, you know, we all work together, and the academics, you know, have this ability to influence policy for many, many people. And, you know, I think to be able to do that while keeping a clear line of sight, because in the language, we get caught up in the language sometimes, and in the labelling, and in this process, it dehumanised people, you know, and it allowed people that we've seen in history to, you know, to abuse others. So it's, you know, and I'm not, I just want to make it clear too, I'm not, you know, I very much respect academics, and, you know, it's just because I don't understand it, it doesn't make it wrong, you know. Just like, just because that photographer didn't understand the people in it, it doesn't make it wrong. You know, we're just trying to communicate and learn from each other so we can all walk forward.
Yeah, and just to answer it more, the compromise in the, as I interpreted your question, it's not up to me to make that decision. Because if it was, we know which way it's going to go. So I guess what the compromise is going to be decided by others. And I think the advantage that, or disadvantage, but in this conversation, let's talk at the advantage. The advantage for us is these institutions are in our country. And these institutions only landed in our country 200 odd years ago. You know, it's like 200 years ago, mate. You know, it's like, so they are trying to find their identity, how they fit into our country. And the European philosophies of connection did have a place in early colonization, but things have shifted in our country. And for the universities or institutions to be relevant today and tomorrow, in particular in our country, they need to listen more, which they are, to our people. How that works for me, if going to another country and knocking on the door of the university or some other institution, you know, that's a different door knock, and it's a different strategy in how you do it. But back in our own country, yeah, we're in an advantage or disadvantage because it's our place, and they understand they need to deal with us for the future. And just there was another question up here about Black Lives Matter, or how I felt about it, and identity and how things fit. And again, I interpreted the question in my way. Yeah, I think it's everyone's searching for home, and at home is who you are. That's, you know, that's your religion, that's your law, that's everything. And I think, and that's the foundation. So I think from a personal front, everyone needs to find that foundation. And once you're able to find that foundation, you can build skyscrapers and see from the top, and see really far. So the challenge is for everyone that's displaced and dispersed and deculturalized from their land is to do your homework and work really hard to find those foundations. Did I answer your question? I don't think she's there anymore.
I think so. We have run out of time. So who's... Okay.
Greetings. I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I just want to share something. I just want to say thank you, first of all, because I feel like we're on similar vibrations and in similar purpose of what we're doing with our art. So I want to just say thank you. There's something that is needed. There's a global reconciliation that is needed. There's a letting go of time as a linear space that is needed so that we can stop. And it has been proven that we can stop. We stopped for COVID because we were ill, and we're still ill, so we need to stop. That's all it is. It's very simple. It's just a matter of accepting and believing that this illness, just like COVID, is unseen. It is inside our being. And that is it, you know? And that's what we're talking about. That's what my work was about last night. That's what your work is about. We're on the same thing. And it's so beautiful and so settling to see that it exists, not just alone where I am, but also in Australia where you are. So big up yourself and respect.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. You know, the issue of the academia and non-academia is not to establish binary between the two. It's only pushing back against the tyranny of the academia, you know, universalization of its formats. That is only, and it's not also valorization of the non-academic space. We need to have critical engagements, reflections everywhere, you know, respectfully. With that, I would close our session. Thank you, my brothers. Thank you so much. Next time you'll bring with you women performers and thinkers. I hope so, because a male-dominated contingency, inshallah. Thank you so very much for your attendance. Before you go, this is not the last sermon. The last sermon will be given by my sister, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that panel. And on that note, we conclude this edition of March Meeting, which convened under the banner of the post-colonial constellation, Art, Culture, Politics after 1960. Thank you to all our speakers, members of the audience, but also the invisible labor of the team backstage, inside the hall, outside, and in our offices. Thank you to everybody. We will also kick off tonight the SB15 music program with a performance by South African pianist Abdallah Ibrahim. This is a ticketed event, so you have to be pre-registered, or you can also purchase your ticket outside at the desk. Thank you so much, and see you next year.